Display layers are a method for organizing a scene, specifically how to control the visibility and color and selectability of multiple objects at once. A display layer is kind of like a group, except groups are more designed to work with transforms like position, whereas display layers relate to visibility and selectability parameters. Layers are very important, especially when the scene gets large and complex with many objects. It really becomes a necessity to put all the objects onto layers. To open up the Layer Explorer, click on the button on the main toolbar, Toggle Layer Explorer. And I'm just going to drag that over to dock it to the interface. And the Layer Explorer is a specialized version of the Scene Explorer that's set up to work just with layers. In every 3ds Max scene, there is a default layer, and it's called Layer 0. Here it is, and I can open it up, and we can see that all 4 of those objects are members of the default Layer 0. To create a new layer, select one or more objects. I'm going to click on the sword blade and then hold down Shift and click on sword hilt to select all 3 of those objects, and then create a new layer by clicking on the button here, Create New Layer. Now, we have a new layer called Layer 001. Let's rename it. I'll click on it and call it Sword Layer and press Enter. Newly created layers are also made active. And I can tell that this is the active layer because its layer icon is highlighted in blue. Any new objects that you build will be added to the active layer. What I recommend is that you make the default layer active, and so any new objects will be added. First, let's create a new layer for this shape or logo. I can rename objects here as well. I can click on Shape 1 and rename it to Logo, press Enter, and with it still selected, create a new layer and rename that one to Logo Layer. And now that new layer is the active one. And if I built any new objects, they would be dropped into the Logo layer. Usually you don't want that, so I recommend that when you're done creating new layers, that you make the default Layer 0 the active one. And any new objects will be dropped into the default Layer 0 and won't get muddled up with your other objects layers. Once objects are on a layer, then we can toggle visibility and other parameters for all objects in that layer. If I want to hide all the sword members, I click on the light bulb icon next to Sword Layer, and now all the sword parts are hidden. I can unhide just as easily. I can freeze by clicking on the layer's snowflake icon, and now all the objects in that layer are frozen. If we want to, we can control display properties on a per object or a per layer basis. I can unfreeze that. For example, we could hide individual members of a layer without hiding the other members. Additionally, we have the ability to inherit certain display properties from a layer and not others. By default in 3ds Max, if you're using the standard Max tool settings, new objects are set to per object display properties, meaning that their display properties are going to override the properties of the layer in which they are contained. Let's say, for example, that I wanted to freeze all the objects, but I didn't want them to display in gray. If I click on Freeze in the layer, then the layer is telling all the objects to be frozen, but the objects have within them properties that say, I'm going to display as gray. And even if I change the layer properties, that wouldn't affect the objects. Let's say I select that layer and then right-click. I can go to Properties and turn off the switch that says Show Frozen in Gray and click OK, but nothing happened because there's a similar property for each object, and that property is taking priority. I can change that behavior. I can select all 3 of these with the Shift key, and then right-click and go into their object properties. And here under Display Properties, we have a button that's labeled By Object. And that's telling us what the current state is. In other words, the object display properties are taking precedence over the layer display properties. If I click that button, then now it displays by layer, and everything gets grayed out. And when I click OK now, frozen objects are no longer displayed in gray because they're inheriting that property from the layer, and the layer property is set to disable display frozen objects in gray. So now when I freeze and unfreeze, I don't see any change in my viewport because I've disabled that option. And I can go back in once again if I wish and go back to properties and re-enable show frozen in gray.